It was mid-November when I decided to take a break from my usual routine and drive out to the countryside. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work, and the idea of being alone in nature sounded like the perfect escape. I packed up my truck with enough supplies for a couple of days. Some canned food, water, my sleeping bag, and a small stove. My plan was simple: drive out to a remote area, hike a bit, and camp under the stars. I didn't have a specific destination in mind. I just wanted solitude. After driving for hours through winding roads and past small towns, I found myself on an old dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was barely visible, hidden between thick trees, and the overgrown bushes scraped against my truck as I followed it. Something about the path intrigued me, though I couldn't say why. It wasn't on the map, but that only made it feel more like the escape I was craving. The dirt road eventually opened into a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. That's when I saw it, the cabin. It stood there, leaning slightly to one side, like it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagged in places, and some of the windows were either broken or boarded up. It didn't look welcoming, but it was fascinating. I told myself I'd just take a quick look. After all, how often do you stumble upon something like this? I parked my truck at the edge of the clearing and grabbed my flashlight. The sun was already starting to set, and the shadows from the trees stretched long across the ground. As I approached the cabin, I noticed small details that made it even eerier. The door was slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. Rusted nails jutted out from the wooden frame, and there were scratch marks on the door. Deep, uneven gouges that didn't seem natural. Pushing the door open took more effort than I expected. It groaned loudly, and a wave of stale air hit me. Inside, it was dark and cold, even though the evening wasn't that chilly. I shone my flashlight around the room. The walls were lined with old shelves, most of them empty except for a few jars filled with what looked like dirt or ash. A table stood in the middle of the room, covered in a thick layer of dust. One of the chairs was tipped over, its leg broken. The cabin had a strange smell, damp wood mixed with something metallic. I figured it was probably rust or old pipes. I moved further inside, my boots crunching on debris scattered across the floor. In the corner, I saw a small fireplace. It was filled with charred wood, as if someone had used it not too long ago. That gave me pause. Who would come out here? There was another room to the left. The door was closed, and the handle was rusted, but it turned when I tried it. The door opened into what must have been a bedroom. A sagging bed frame sat against the wall, the mattress long gone. There were a few tattered blankets piled in the corner and what looked like old clothes scattered on the floor. They were so faded and torn that I couldn't tell much about them. I decided I'd seen enough. This place wasn't just abandoned. It felt wrong. As I turned to leave, my flashlight flickered. It wasn't dead, but the beam wavered like the batteries were about to give out. I smacked it against my hand, and the light steadied, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Outside, the sun had completely set, and the clearing was bathed in a pale moonlight. I should have driven off right then, but something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was stubbornness. I told myself it was too late to find another spot to camp, so I decided I'd spend the night in my truck. I locked the doors and pulled my sleeping bag over me, but sleep didn't come easily. The cabin was visible through my windshield, its dark silhouette outlined against the trees. Every creak and rustle outside made me tense. At one point, I thought I saw movement near the cabin, a shadow darting past one of the broken windows. I sat up, my heart pounding, but nothing happened. I told myself it was just my imagination. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I dozed off. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the truck. It was faint at first, like the wind brushing against the glass, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Tap, Tap, tap. I froze, too scared to move. My flashlight was still in my lap, and I gripped it tightly, my mind racing. What could it be? An animal? A branch? I mustered the courage to look out the window, but I didn't see anything. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, and close. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps circled the truck, crunching on the gravel. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel their presence. Whoever or whatever it was, they were just outside. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped near the driver's side. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I waited, expecting the worst, but nothing happened. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. I don't know how I found the courage, but I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. I slammed the truck into reverse and backed out of the clearing as fast as I could. My headlights swept over the cabin one last time, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the doorway, a tall figure, half hidden in the shadows. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, miles away from that cabin. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, too afraid of what I might see. When I got home, I tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, amplified by the isolation and the eerie setting. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something or someone had been out there, and whatever it was, it didn't want me there. I never went back to that area, and I made sure to stick to well-traveled paths after that. But even now, years later, I still think about that night. Sometimes I wonder if that cabin is still standing, hidden in the woods, waiting for someone else to stumble upon it. And I wonder what they'll find when they do. I've worked as a park ranger for over a decade. It's not a glamorous job, but it suits me. I like the solitude, the steady rhythm of the seasons, and the feeling of being a guardian for the land. My cabin is small and functional, tucked into a clearing surrounded by miles of dense forest. It's the kind of place where silence can be deafening, where even the smallest sound, a branch snapping or the rustle of leaves, can feel like a shout. It was early November, the kind of cold where the chill settles deep in your bones. I was alone as usual. There weren't many visitors that time of year, and most of the seasonal staff had already left. My days were spent doing routine patrols, checking trails, and occasionally cleaning up after careless hikers who thought the woods were their personal trash can. That day, I had just returned to the cabin after a long patrol. The sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched out like fingers between the trees. I locked up the ATV, pulled off my gloves, and stepped inside. The cabin was simple. A small kitchenette, a desk piled with maps and reports, a cot in the corner, and a wood stove that was my only source of heat. I lit the stove, filled the kettle for tea, and sat down to update my logbook. It was then I noticed something unusual. On the edge of the desk, half hidden under a stack of papers, was a folded piece of paper. I didn't remember leaving it there. My first thought was that it was just a note I'd written and forgotten about. But when I opened it, I froze. The handwriting was neat, almost too perfect, and it wasn't mine. The message was short, "You're not alone." I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. It didn't make sense. No one had been here. The cabin door was locked when I returned, and I hadn't seen anyone all day. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and scanned the room. Everything looked normal. Nothing was out of place, but the air felt heavier, as if the room itself was watching me. I told myself it was probably a prank. Maybe one of the other rangers had left it before they packed up for the season, though I couldn't think of anyone who would bother. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I folded the note and slid it into my pocket. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but I couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside, felt amplified. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows before crawling into my cot. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was restless and shallow. The next morning, the sun was bright, and the woods looked almost peaceful. The unease from the night before felt like a distant memory. I convinced myself I'd overreacted. It was just a stupid note, after all. I spent the day on another patrol, hiking a remote trail that wound through a thick section of forest. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the occasional call of a bird. When I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, the first thing I noticed was that the door was slightly ajar. My stomach sank. I was sure I'd locked it. I pushed it open cautiously, half expecting to find an animal that had somehow gotten inside. Instead, the cabin was empty. At least it looked empty. I stepped inside, my hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray on my belt. Everything seemed as I'd left it, except for a new note on the desk. My heart pounded as I picked it up. This one read, "Why do you lock the door?" I felt a wave of cold wash over me. This wasn't a prank. Someone had been inside. They'd left me another message, and they'd done it while I was out in the woods. I checked every corner of the cabin, opened every drawer, and even looked under the cot. There was no one there, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I decided to report it. I grabbed the radio and called the nearest station, but the static-filled response wasn't reassuring. They promised to send someone out in the morning, but they were short-staffed, and the remoteness of my cabin meant I was on my own for the night. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the lights on, sitting by the window with my flashlight and a hunting knife, listening for any sound that didn't belong. By morning, I was exhausted. I made a pot of coffee and tried to shake off the paranoia. Help would arrive soon, I told myself. I just had to hold out a little longer. But as the hours passed, no one showed up. The radio crackled occasionally, but there was no word from the station. Around noon, I decided to do a quick patrol around the cabin. Maybe I'd find footprints or some sign of whoever was messing with me. I grabbed my jacket, stepped outside, and began circling the clearing. The ground was hard, the frozen earth not giving much away, but near the edge of the trees, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. They were fresh, leading away from the cabin and into the forest. I followed them cautiously, my hand on the bear spray. The tracks wound through the trees, zigzagging in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if whoever made them wanted to be followed. After about half a mile, they stopped abruptly. There was nothing, no sign of a struggle, no broken branches, just a dead end. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, but the forest was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your skin crawl. I hurried back to the cabin, my nerves frayed. When I stepped inside, I froze. The kettle was on the stove, steam curling from its spout. I hadn't left it there. On the table was a third note. "Why did you stop?" That night was the longest of my life. I barricaded the door with the desk and piled furniture against the windows. I kept the knife and bear spray within arm's reach, my heart racing at every creak and groan of the cabin. I felt trapped, like a cornered animal, and the sense of being watched was unbearable. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of something outside. It was faint, a soft rustling, like someone walking through the leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear. The noise grew louder, then stopped right outside the door. And then, a knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knock came again, followed by a low, muffled voice I couldn't make out. I clutched the knife, my hands shaking, and waited. Minutes passed, then hours. The knocking stopped, but I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn filtered through the windows. When I finally unbarricaded the door and stepped outside, the clearing was empty. But on the ground, just a few feet from the door, was a final note. "See you soon." I didn't stay to find out what it meant. By the time reinforcements arrived later that day, I was packed and ready to leave. I transferred to a different park, far from that cabin, far from those woods. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about those notes, about the footprints, about the knock on the door. And I wonder if soon is closer than I'd like to believe. I'd always loved the quiet of the countryside. There was something about being away from the chaos of the city that put me at ease. My uncle's farm, tucked away in the rolling hills of rural Kansas, became my go-to escape whenever life got overwhelming. He wasn't around anymore. He'd passed a few years ago, but the place still felt like home. When I inherited it, I decided to fix it up and spend some weekends there. It was a typical early October evening when I arrived at the farm. The rain had been falling steadily since the afternoon, and the drive out had been slow and slippery. The gravel road leading to the cabin was a muddy mess, and I had to leave my truck about a quarter-mile away when it got stuck. By the time I trudged up to the house, I was soaked to the bone, my boots caked with mud. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was a single-story building with a small porch and a tin roof. The wood was weathered, and the paint had long since peeled away. I'd fixed up the interior a bit, new locks, patched windows, a fresh coat of paint on the walls, but it still had that old, creaky feeling to it. It always felt alive in a way, like it was watching me as much as I was watching over it. The rain hammered against the roof as I stepped inside. I flicked on the light switch, and the single bulb in the living room buzzed to life. The place smelled faintly of damp wood and mustiness, but I didn't mind. It was cozy in its own way. I dropped my bag by the door, shrugged out of my wet jacket, and kicked off my boots. I had planned to spend the night cleaning out the back storage room, which was still cluttered with my uncle's old stuff. There were tools, boxes of papers, and random odds and ends I hadn't had the heart to go through yet. But first, I needed to warm up. I started a fire in the small wood-burning stove in the corner. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. I sat on the old couch for a while, sipping a cup of instant coffee and listening to the rain. The wind picked up, making the cabin creak and groan. It was the kind of night where you felt completely cut off from the world, wrapped in the embrace of the storm. After a while, I decided to get to work. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the back storage room. The light bulb in there had burned out ages ago, and I hadn't bothered to replace it yet. The room was packed floor to ceiling with stuff. Rusty tools, old furniture, boxes of canned goods that had expired years ago. It smelled stale, like dust and forgotten memories. I started with the nearest box, sorting through papers that mostly seemed to be old receipts and letters. There wasn't anything particularly interesting, but I kept at it, hoping to make a dent in the clutter. Time passed slowly, the storm outside a constant backdrop. About an hour in, I came across something odd. It was a small metal lockbox, tucked away at the bottom of a crate. It was heavier than I expected, and the lock was rusted shut. I took it back to the living room, set it on the coffee table, and used a hammer and screwdriver to pry it open. Inside, there were a few old photographs, a couple of keys, and a yellowed notebook. The photos were black and white, mostly of the farm, but there were a few of people I didn't recognize. The keys didn't seem familiar either, but it was the notebook that caught my attention. The cover was plain, and the pages inside were filled with my uncle's handwriting. At first, it seemed like a journal. He wrote about the crops, the weather, and the usual day-to-day stuff of farm life. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone began to change. There were entries about hearing strange noises at night, knocking on the walls, footsteps outside the cabin, whispers he couldn't place. He wrote about finding things moved around in the morning, tools that weren't where he'd left them, the back door unlocked even though he swore he'd locked it. The last few entries were the most unsettling. My uncle described seeing someone or something out in the fields. He called it the Watcher. He wrote about its tall, thin figure, its long arms, and the way it stood perfectly still, just at the edge of the tree line. He said it never came close, but it was always there, just watching. I set the notebook down, a chill running down my spine. My uncle had always been a practical man, not one for wild stories or imagination. But the way he wrote about the Watcher was different. Felt real, like he truly believed it was out there. I tried to shake off the unease and went back to sorting through the rest of the box. But the storm seemed louder now, the cabin darker. The wind howled, and I thought I heard something outside. A faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on the porch. I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the front door. My heart was pounding as I unlocked it and swung it open, the rain lashing against my face. The porch was empty. The muddy ground in front of the steps showed no footprints. I stood there for a moment, scanning the yard with the flashlight. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the trees in the distance. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. The rest of the night was a blur of unease. I couldn't focus on the clutter in the storage room anymore. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Every gust of wind sounded like something trying to get in. I ended up sitting by the fire, clutching the flashlight and staring at the door. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up to silence. The storm had passed, and the cabin was eerily quiet. The first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. I felt a strange sense of relief, like the danger had passed with the night. But as I stepped outside to check on my truck, I froze. In the muddy ground in front of the porch, there were footprints. They were large, barefoot, and far too long to be human. They led from the tree line to the porch and then back again. I didn't bother cleaning the storage room that day. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and left. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. It was the summer of 2017, and we decided to spend a few days at my grandfather's old cabin in the woods. The cabin had been in our family for generations, and though it wasn't anything fancy, it was sturdy and full of memories. My wife, Sarah, her younger sister, Emma, and I thought it would be a great way to unplug and relax. Grandpa had passed away years ago, and since then, the cabin hadn't been used much. It seemed like the perfect escape from our busy lives. We packed our bags, loaded the car, and drove about 3 hours into the countryside of northern Maine. The cabin sat in a remote area surrounded by dense forest, far away from any neighbors or cell service. When we arrived, I couldn't help but notice how overgrown the area had become. The gravel driveway was barely visible under the weeds, and the porch sagged slightly, the wood faded from years of exposure. Inside, the cabin was as I remembered, rustic but comfortable. The living room was small, with an old couch, a wood-burning stove, and a coffee table scarred from years of use. A small kitchen was off to the side, and down the narrow hallway were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. We spent the first day cleaning up. Sarah and Emma dusted and swept while I chopped wood and cleared the brush around the property. By evening, the place felt cozy. We lit a fire in the stove and sat around it, eating sandwiches and telling stories. The first night passed without incident. We slept soundly. The the silence of the forest broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of leaves. The second day, we explored the woods behind the cabin. Grandpa had always talked about the trails he'd cleared out there, though they were now barely visible under layers of fallen leaves and debris. As we walked, Emma found an old metal sign nailed to a tree. It was rusty and faded, but we could just make out the words, "Private property, no trespassing." It seemed odd. This was family land, so who would put up a sign like that? We shrugged it off, assuming it was something Grandpa had put up years ago, and kept walking. That evening, while Sarah was cooking dinner, I decided to take a look in the basement. Grandpa's cabin had always been a bit of a mystery to me. He was the type to collect odd things, and I remembered as a kid being both fascinated and creeped out by what he kept down there. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick and damp. I used my phone's flashlight to look around. There were old tools, jars of nails and screws, and shelves stacked with faded newspapers and books. But what caught my eye was a small, locked metal box tucked away in the corner. It looked out of place, newer than everything else. I carried it upstairs, where Sarah and Emma were setting the table. I told them about the box, and we all speculated about what might be inside. But without a key, there was no way to open it. We decided to leave it for now and eat dinner. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The cabin, which had felt warm and inviting the day before, now seemed oppressive. Every creak of the wooden walls and gust of wind against the windows set me on edge. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I got up quietly, not wanting to wake Sarah or Emma, and looked out the window. The moonlight illuminated the yard, but I didn't see anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were large and deep, as though someone had been walking barefoot. I showed Sarah and Emma, but we couldn't agree on what to make of it. Maybe someone had wandered onto the property, or maybe it was an animal. Still, it left us unsettled. We spent the day close to the cabin, reluctant to venture into the woods again. I tried to distract myself by working on small repairs around the property. Sarah read a book, and Emma painted a watercolor of the forest. By late afternoon, the weather had turned. Thick clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. We decided to spend the evening indoors, playing cards and listening to music on a portable speaker. That night, the storm hit. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Around midnight, the power went out. We lit a few candles and huddled in the living room, waiting for the storm to pass. That's when we heard it, a faint knocking sound coming from the direction of the basement. It was rhythmic, like someone tapping on the floorboards. At first, I thought it might be an animal trapped under the house, but the sound was too deliberate. It stopped for a few minutes, then started again, louder this time. Emma looked at me, her face pale. "Should we check it out?" she asked. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the basement door. The air was colder down there, and the beam of light barely penetrated the darkness. I descended the stairs, heart pounding. The basement was empty, just as I had left it. The metal box was still on the table upstairs, so I knew no one had been down here. But as I turned to go back up, I noticed something on the floor. A series of muddy footprints leading from the stairs to the far wall. The next morning, we decided we couldn't stay any longer. We packed up quickly, anxious to leave the cabin behind. Before we left, I grabbed the metal box, thinking I could open it later. As we drove away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But that relief was short-lived. A few days after we returned home, I managed to pry open the box. Inside was a collection of old photographs and handwritten notes. The photos showed the cabin, but in every picture, there was a man standing in the background. He was tall and thin with long, unkempt hair. The notes described strange events on the property: noises in the woods, missing animals, and sightings of a stranger lurking near the cabin. One note, dated just a few months before Grandpa's death, simply read, "I see him watching me. To this day, I don't know who the man was or what he wanted. All I know is that something was out there, and it had been watching us the whole time." It was late September when my gym partner, Eric, invited me to a cabin his company had rented for an annual business retreat. I had met Eric about 2 years ago at our local gym in Denver. He was a personal trainer, but we bonded over shared workout routines and mutual frustrations about dieting. He'd often talk about his job as a project manager for a tech company, and this cabin trip was supposed to be a mix of work and leisure. "I'll get some work done, and you can enjoy the view," Eric had told me. "The place is huge, and it's got all the stuff you'll need: Wi-Fi, a stocked kitchen, everything." I didn't have much going on that weekend, so I agreed. It was a 6-hour drive to a remote part of Montana. Eric picked me up early Friday morning in his old SUV. The first couple of hours passed in comfortable silence, the road stretching ahead under a pale blue sky. But as we got closer to the cabin, the towns grew smaller, the gas stations more sparse, and the cell signal weaker. By the time we turned onto a dirt road surrounded by dense forest, it was mid-afternoon. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. I felt an uneasy tension creep up my spine, but I brushed it off as nerves. The cabin itself was massive, a sprawling wooden structure perched on the edge of a small lake. It looked like it belonged in a movie, a picture-perfect retreat in the wilderness. Eric parked the car and we grabbed our bags. The air was crisp, with the faint scent of pine and the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. Inside, the cabin was even more impressive. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, and modern furniture. The kitchen had stainless steel appliances, and the living room had a massive fireplace. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs and 1 downstairs, along with a study and a game room. Eric seemed in his element, already setting up his laptop in the study. "I'll need a few hours to prep for the meeting tomorrow," he said. I nodded, deciding to explore the property. The lake was serene, its surface smooth as glass. I walked along the shore, noting the eerie silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. The forest on the far side of the lake looked darker than it should have been, even in the afternoon light. When I returned to the cabin, Eric was still working. I spent the rest of the evening reading a book I'd brought while he tinkered with spreadsheets and emails. We had a quiet dinner and went to bed early, both of us exhausted from the drive. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I sat up, I realized it was coming from outside. It sounded like footsteps crunching on gravel. I froze, my ears straining to catch any other sounds. The cabin was silent. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Slowly, I got up and moved to the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, but I didn't see anything unusual. The next morning, I mentioned it to Eric over breakfast. He shrugged it off. "Probably a deer or something," he said, pouring coffee into his mug. Eric left for his meeting around 10 a.m., leaving me alone in the cabin. I decided to go for a hike, hoping to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. There was a trailhead near the cabin, marked by an old wooden sign. The hike was beautiful but oddly unsettling. The forest was dense, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. I cut the hike short and returned to the cabin. Eric wasn't back yet, so I made myself a sandwich and settled in the living room. The sun was setting when I heard the footsteps again, this time on the deck outside. My heart raced as I stood up, my eyes fixed on the sliding glass doors. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, but nothing happened. When Eric came back, I told him about the footsteps. He frowned but didn't seem overly concerned. "We're in the middle of nowhere," he said. "Could be anything." But that night, the footsteps came again. This time, they were accompanied by a faint tapping on the windows. I stayed in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the noises until they stopped just before dawn. The next day, Eric had another meeting, leaving me alone again. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I didn't find anything unusual until I reached the back of the cabin, where the woods were thickest. There, in the soft dirt, were footprints, bare human footprints. I showed them to Eric when he got back. He looked uneasy but tried to rationalize it. "Maybe someone wandered too close," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe his own words. That night, we both stayed up, sitting in the living room with the lights off, listening. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps returned, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Eric and I exchanged a glance but didn't say a word. Then came the tapping, this time louder, more insistent. It moved from window to window as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to find a way in. Eric grabbed a fireplace poker, and I picked up a kitchen knife. We crept to the nearest window, but there was nothing there. The noises continued for hours, fading just before dawn. By the fourth day, Eric decided to cut the trip short. "We'll leave first thing tomorrow," he said. Couldn't have agreed more. That night, we barricaded the doors and windows with furniture. But the footsteps came back, louder than ever, accompanied by scratching on the walls. Then, just after midnight, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness. Eric and I huddled in the living room, our makeshift weapons in hand, waiting for the night to end. At some point, exhaustion overcame me, and I dozed off. When I woke up, the sun was rising, and Eric was gone. His laptop and bag were still in the study, but there was no sign of him. I searched the cabin and the surrounding area, calling his name, but he was nowhere to be found. The only thing I found was a single, bare footprint in the dirt behind the cabin. Panicked, I drove to the nearest town and called the police. They searched the area but found no trace of Eric. The official report listed him as a missing person. To this day, I don't know what happened that night or where Eric went. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of footsteps outside my window, and I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, somewhere in those woods. The year was 2013, and I was 28 years old. I remember that weekend vividly, even though I wish I could forget it. It was late October, and the air had that crisp chill that hinted winter was just around the corner. I had been working long hours in the city, and the stress of my job was starting to wear on me. So, when my friend Nate offered me his family's cabin for a weekend, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was in northern Minnesota, tucked away in a dense forest near the edge of a small lake. It wasn't much, just a one-room structure with a tiny kitchen, a creaky old bed, and a wood stove for heat. But it was isolated, and that's what I needed. No traffic, no cell service, no noise except for the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a loon on the water. I left the city Friday morning and arrived at the cabin by early afternoon. The drive took longer than I expected, with the last few miles winding through narrow, gravel roads that seemed to get rougher the farther I went. By the time I arrived, the sun was already beginning to sink lower in the sky. The cabin looked exactly like Nate described it. Small, weathered, and surrounded by towering pines. There was no driveway, just a patch of dirt where I parked my car. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the door, fumbling with the old brass key Nate had given me. The lock turned with a satisfying click, and I stepped inside. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight streaming through the single window. The only furniture was a wooden table, a couple of mismatched chairs, and the bed pushed against the far wall. It was basic, but it felt cozy in its own way. I spent the first couple of hours unpacking and getting settled. I stacked the firewood Nate had left by the stove, checked the pantry for food, and made a mental note to boil some water from the lake since there was no running water. By the time I had everything organized, the sun was setting, and the forest outside was bathed in a golden glow. I decided to make a fire and sit outside for a while. There was a small fire pit a few yards from the cabin, surrounded by a ring of stones. I gathered some kindling and larger logs, then lit the fire. The flames crackled to life, sending sparks dancing into the twilight sky. As I sat there, staring into the flames, I felt the stress of the week begin to melt away. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional splash from the lake. I stayed out there for hours, letting the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the woods wash over me. It was close to midnight when I finally decided to head inside. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night had grown colder. I doused the fire with water, then made my way back to the cabin. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was how dark it was. The single window didn't let in much moonlight, and I hadn't thought to leave a lantern burning. I fumbled for my flashlight, which I had left on the table, and switched it on. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they were just smudges on the floor, maybe dirt I had tracked in earlier. But as I moved the flashlight closer, I realized they were footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were faint but distinct, leading from the door to the bed and then back again. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I stared at them. They were smaller than my feet, maybe a woman's or a teenager's. I told myself it must have been my imagination. Maybe I had made the tracks without realizing it. Or maybe they had been there all along, left by Nate or someone else who had used the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone had been inside while I was outside by the fire. I locked the door and double-checked the windows to make sure they were secure. Then I climbed into bed, leaving the flashlight on the table within arm's reach. The night was long and restless. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind brushing against the walls, the distant howl of a coyote. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke with a start to the sound of something outside. It was faint at first, like someone walking through the leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the window. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but the beam only illuminated the inside of the cabin. The noise stopped. For a long time, I sat there in the dark, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or a deer, but deep down I didn't believe it. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the window, and the forest outside came to life. I forced myself to get out of bed and go outside to check. The ground was covered in a light frost, but there were no tracks, no signs that anyone or anything had been there. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I went for a hike, gathered more firewood, and even tried fishing in the lake. By the time evening came, I felt a little better, though I couldn't bring myself to sit outside by the fire again. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they weren't outside, they were inside. I woke to the sound of faint creaking, like someone moving across the floor. My heart raced as I lay there, clutching the flashlight. The noise stopped, then started again, closer this time. I sat up, shining the light around the cabin. Nothing, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was overwhelming. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. When morning finally came, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things and loaded the car, eager to put as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. As I was leaving, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, weathered sign nailed to a tree near the cabin. It read, "In memory of Sarah Thompson, 1985 to 2003. Gone, but not forgotten." I didn't know who Sarah Thompson was or what had happened to her, but I didn't care to find out. The drive back to the city was long and quiet. I never told Nate what happened that weekend, and I've never been back to the cabin. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those creaking sounds in my mind, and I wonder if Sarah ever really left. I sat in the cabin, staring at the flickering fluorescent light above me. It was one of those nights where everything felt off. The year was 2013, and I had just started working the night shift at a remote hunting lodge deep in the woods of northern Montana. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills and gave me a place to stay. The lodge wasn't in use this time of year, so my duties mainly revolved around maintenance and security. The nearest town was over an hour's drive away, and the lodge itself was surrounded by miles of dense forest. There was no cell service, and the landline in the cabin was my only connection to the outside world. My cabin sat about 100 yards from the main lodge, a modest structure with creaky wooden floors, a wood stove for heat, and a single window overlooking the dark forest. It was early October, and the days had started to grow shorter. By the time I settled in for my shift at 7 p.m., the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the forest into shadow. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the wind howled through the trees, making the cabin feel colder than it should have. My job wasn't particularly demanding. I was supposed to do a quick sweep of the lodge and its surrounding area every few hours, ensure the generator was running smoothly, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. Most nights were uneventful. Occasionally, I'd hear coyotes or see the glint of a deer's eyes in the dark, but that was about it. That night, as I sipped my coffee and flipped through an old magazine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that way out here. The isolation had a way of playing tricks on your mind. Around 9 p.m., I grabbed my flashlight and headed out for my first sweep. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed violently, their branches creaking and groaning. The main lodge loomed in the darkness, its massive wooden doors secured with heavy locks. I shined my flashlight over the windows, peering inside to make sure everything was as it should be. The lodge was empty, just as it had been for weeks. I checked the generator shed next, finding everything in working order. The rhythmic hum of the generator was oddly comforting, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. Satisfied that everything was fine, I headed back to the cabin. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The light in the cabin, which I had left on, was now off. I stopped in my tracks, my breath visible in the cold night air. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was a power fluctuation. It wasn't uncommon for the generator to hiccup, especially in this weather. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine. I slowly made my way to the cabin, my flashlight beam bouncing off the trees. When I reached the door, I paused to listen. The wind howled, and the branches rattled against the roof, but there was no other sound. I opened the door cautiously, my flashlight sweeping the room. Everything seemed normal except for the light, which was definitely off. I flipped the switch a few times, but nothing happened. I checked the breaker box, which was located just outside the cabin. All the switches were in place. Confused, I decided to let it go and return to the cabin. I lit the kerosene lamp on the table and sat back down, trying to shake off the unease. The next few hours passed slowly. I kept hearing faint noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but I convinced myself it was the wind. Around midnight, I decided to do another sweep. As I stepped outside, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The forest felt different, almost too quiet. I made my way to the main lodge, scanning the area with my flashlight. Everything was as I had left it. When I turned to head back to the cabin, I noticed something strange on the ground. A set of footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, leading from the direction of the cabin into the woods. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the footprints. They were large, probably made by someone wearing boots. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The prints led deeper into the woods, away from the safety of the cabin and lodge. After about 50 yards, the footprints suddenly stopped. There was no sign of where the person had gone. No broken branches, no disturbed leaves. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. I stood there, my heart pounding, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against my flashlight beam. Realizing how exposed I was, I hurried back to the cabin. My footsteps crunched loudly on the gravel, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and checked all the windows. The kerosene lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the small room feel even smaller. I sat down, clutching my flashlight, my eyes darting to the window every time I thought I saw movement outside. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and paranoia. I didn't leave the cabin again. Every creak of the wood stove, every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. As dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I grabbed my bag, locked up the cabin, and drove straight to town without looking back. When I told my boss what had happened, he dismissed it as an overactive imagination. But I knew what I saw, and more importantly, what I felt. Someone or something had been out there that night, and whoever they were, they didn't want to be found. I never returned to that lodge, and to this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before or since.